Alrighty, y'all. Welcome back to the Southern Appalachian Anglers YouTube page. So let's talk about dry flies here for a bit. Dry fly fishing is by far one of my favorite ways to catch trout. But one thing I've learned over the course of the last few years is that not all two dry flies are tied equally. And regardless of whether you're tying your own or buying them in the store, there's certain things you can look for in terms of how they're tied. They'll actually help their buoyancy or how they float on the water. Also try to explain the characteristics of why dry flies are tied in certain ways. And a couple modifications you can do that actually help them float a little bit better, especially if you're using these on like a dry dropper rig, for example. So we'll start out here by breaking down basically the two different types of dry flies that are out now. You've got flies that are tied primarily out of foam. That's their main material that's going to help or affect its buoyancy. And you've got flies that are tied out of more natural materials like this Stimulator right here. I'm going to start out actually with the flies that are tied out of more natural materials, because this category of them is going to be a little bit more in depth. But a fly like a Stimulator like this has things like deer hair and hackle on it, hackle just being the feather off of a chicken traditionally, and those two types of materials are actually going to affect how it floats. So a hackle tied around the shank of the hook, like on this one right here, or like on maybe a traditional Adams style dry fly, what that does is that these hackle fibers are displacing water. So it's kind of allowing, if you can imagine my finger right there as the water, the dry fly is supposed to sit on the water like this, i.e. up above the surface film. The more hackle that you have and the stiffer the hackle fibers, the better that it floats. Deer hair, conversely, is hollow on the inside. Same thing goes for elk hair as well. And that helps its buoyancy as well, having those fibers that are hollow and doesn't allow water to absorb into them. Flies like a parachute style fly, like this Parachute Adams right here, are designed to lay more so in the surface film. So if you can imagine, again, my finger as sort of the surface film of the water, the fly is actually going to sit a little bit more like this, because the fibers of the hackle are wrapped around this parachute post here, which is traditionally tied out of calf tail. And what that does is that the fibers are displacing water, but the fly itself is more or less just sitting in the water like this, and the body is completely submerged in the film. Okay, so I'm going to show y'all basically what to look for in terms of a good dry fly versus one that's not so great. So we're going to start with the one that's not so great. This is a very cheaply tied and made Stimulator. I think I got this for like 75 cents somewhere online just to try them out. If you'll notice here, there's very few hackle fibers. The ones that are on there are relatively stiff. Oops, I don't drop it there. They're not stiff, I should say. And so what that's going to do is it's not going to displace as much water, and it's going to cause that fly to sink more. Now, this part right here on the body that's tied out of dubbing is not necessarily buoyant or water resistant. So over time, this fly is just going to sink after maybe a couple of drifts on the water the first time after it gets eaten by a fish. If we also notice here too, as I flare this wing out, there's not really a lot of deer hair right there either. So that's another thing that's going to act as sort of like a detriment. Conversely, when I look at this Stimulator right here that's actually tied really well, you can see there's a ample amount of hackle fibers going all the way up and down the body, up here into the thorax, and there's also an ample amount of deer hair tied into there as well. The rubber legs, I'm not going to say that doesn't affect its buoyancy and sort of help with that water displacement, but I never really have noticed the difference in a fly has rubber legs and doesn't have rubber legs in terms of how well it floats. But what you want to look for in terms of a good dry fly, whether you're tying them or whether you're buying them in a store, is you want a fly that looks like this. Plenty of hackle fibers, lots of deer hair stacked in the wing. That's going to float really well compared to one like this. Let's see if we can get a side-by-side comparison of them right here. You can see how the one on the left has way more hackle fibers than the one on the right. There's also a lot more deer hair on the one on the left as well. Okay, so that's one thing I look for. Now, when it comes to a fly like this Parachute Adams right here, calf tail, like I mentioned a second ago, calf tail is what traditionally the post is actually tied out of. But one thing about calf tail is that it's actually not very water resistant at all. So one trick that I've learned that you can do with a parachute style fly is to take a pair of scissors and simply cut. I'm going to see if I can get this to focus. cut that parachute post down about like that. I'm going to clean this up a little bit if we want to. I don't think the fish are going to care too much, but cut down to about like that. Okay, and you don't want to cut it down too far, because if you cut down too far, the hackle fibers are going to obviously unwrap off of the post. What I do then is I take my finger, just kind of push this down and kind of splay the remaining fibers out, and boom, there you go. The whole point of the post on there, in addition to having something to wrap the hackle around, is so you can see the fly when it's laying on the water. But having that excess amount of calf tail off keeps that fly from absorbing too much water and allows it to float for a lot longer, instead of just sinking down. Because when you have a fly with an excess amount of post material, that fly will also generally tend to roll over. That fly then absorbs all the water on the surface film, and it just causes it to sink. That's going to float a lot better and then conversely catch more fish for you. Now, one thing about flies, they're tied on natural materials, is regardless of how much hackle or deer hair you have on there, it's eventually going to sink, especially, like I said, if you're using it on a dry dropper, and let's say you got like a heavy tungsten nymph tied off the end of the hook right there, it's going to eventually pull that fly down, and especially after catching a couple of fish, that fly is just not going to want to float anymore. So when it comes to floating, I very seldomly use the gel floating. And before I get too ahead of myself here, let me talk about the different types of floating that are available. You basically got a powdered silicone floating, like this stuff right here, this frog's fanny, and you've got floating that's more like a liquid gel. The gel floating, which I actually don't have any because that just shows you how much I fish with it, the gel floating doesn't do well with flies like this. The gel tends to gunk up all these natural fibers and sort of just, it just kind of just gunks up the whole thing and just makes it to where you lose all of that ability for surface tension to be displaced, and it just causes that fly to sink like a rock. Having this stuff right here actually enables the silicone powder to sort of cling onto each individual fiber and piece of hair. And while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to show you all what I do actually to help apply this fiber a little bit more evenly on your fly. Now, if you notice on the brush right here, it's the fibers of the brush itself are splayed out. That's something that I did myself in order to help all the in order to help these fibers sort of bury into the material that these natural dry flies are tied out of. And the way to get that is just take this and just sort of drill it into a hard surface like this and cause all those fibers to splay out. The reason why I do that, again, is because most of the time when you get these little applicators, the fibers of the brush are just sticking straight down, and you can't really get as much of the powdered silicone on your dry fly as what's applicable or what's needed in order to float this fly. So what I do in order to apply this stuff, I'm going to get a pretty liberal amount of this powdered silicone, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to first start on the underside of the dry fly, starting on the back. I'm going to bury this, and I hope the camera's picking this up here, but I'm going to bury a good amount into the tail fibers. You want to get a good amount on the underside as well, because that dubbing is generally not water resistant whatsoever, so I'm going to make sure I bury a good amount in there. I mean, really, don't be afraid to really try and dig on this fly and get as much of that silicone powder in there as you can. A little bit more on there, and then get some right here on the underside. Oops, on the underside of my hackle fibers there, and then again on the top. And again, don't be afraid to bury that brush down in there. But that fly right there is going to float a lot longer and a lot better now. That'll last for up to 3 or 4 fish in most cases before you have to reapply it again if you're fishing a dry fly by itself. But it also helps in particular when you're fishing it like with a dry dropper. Having that added floating on there is going to help that fly hold up the weight of your nymph when you're fishing it on a dry dropper. Okay, so that's flies tied out of natural materials out of the way. Let's talk about foam here for a second. Okay, so basically with foam, you're traditionally going to see that in flies that are more meant to mimic terrestrials. And I like using flies that are tied out of foam, particularly if I've got clients who are sort of new to fly fishing, because a big foam terrestrial is much easier for someone to see floating down in the water. There's a couple things I look for when I'm fishing a foam fly. So a fly like this Chernobyl right here, if you'll notice on it, it's only got one layer of foam, okay? And that's not a bad thing. It just means I'm probably just going to fish this fly by itself. And one thing about all this Antron stuff right here, this stuff does not repel water whatsoever. And it also doesn't really hold on to floating that well either. So one thing I will do is I'll sometimes cut off, just like I did on that Parachute Adams, I'll just cut off some of this wing right here. And again, you don't have to make it too fancy because really I don't think the fish care that much. If you think about it, the whole idea of a wing to me is not, again, really necessary because the fish are going to see that part of it right there. They're not going to really see the top of the fly. This is for the angler in order to be able to see it on the water. So if you got relatively good eyesight like me, you can go ahead and trim this stuff down. Again, I don't think it really matters all that much, but for me anyway, that just helps the fly to float a little bit better because this stuff tends to absorb water and doesn't really do anything to help the fly float. It's just more weight to cause this fly to sink down. So that's one thing you can do, but if I'm fishing with a dry dropper, I'm going to look for a fly that's got multiple layers of foam in it. So like on this Fat Albert right here, if you'll notice, even up here on the head, there's 1, 2, 3 layers of foam on there, and I've got 2 layers of foam over here in the back at least. So not only are my clients going to be able to see this fly very well, but it's also going to be able to hold up like a heavy tungsten nymph. Like you can use a size 14 Frenchie with a 5/32 bead on it, and this fly will hold it up just fine. It's great, if you've got like a beginner and you're fishing out in the summertime and you want to try to get them a big fish, especially because we all know big trout love eating terrestrials. What it also does is it allows them more fishing time because a fly like this does not need floating applied to it over and over again. It'll hold up a really heavily weighted nymph just fine. But, those are some tricks that I've learned from guiding and fishing this stuff over the course of my life. If you have any other questions regarding dry fly fishing or really any other type of fishing that we do here in the mountains, don't hesitate to give us a holler. Hope to see y'all on the water soon, and tight lines.